There's an article in the Los Angeles Times saying Boko Haram is bad, but don't overlook Nigeria's corrupt ways. Is this corruption sort of leading to this type of insurgency?
I think that the causal link between corruption and Boko Haram is there, but it's more complicated than people kind of think. The anger that Boko Haram feel does come through, they see that the wealth of the political elites is somehow unjustified, unpure, not accounted for in the correct way, and therefore this must be corruption. But it then also affects, in the terms of the capacity of people to follow up within institutions like the police. The corruption is in a breakdown in the hierarchies, in the way that things are done, rather than there are a big kind of meta story of corruption that leads to Boko Haram. There's a much more kind of difficult causal link.
Before we move on to our feature story, James, can I ask you about the Central African Republic? Now, last week we had Gregory Barrow from the World Food Programme there, and he said that people just weren't paying enough attention to the crisis in the country. We saw there lots of aid workers not being able to go out there and do what they need to do. Why aren't we paying attention to the crisis there?
Well, Central African Republic is a neglected country at the very best of times, and also in better times is already facing enormous humanitarian challenges. There was an MSF report from about 3 years ago, so before this crisis started, that health indicators there were already at emergency levels. And because the internet, no outside country really has large economic or social or even kind of aid development ties, it's underfunded. But also we have a problem underfunding crises in general. So if we look at the crisis next door from Central African Republic, South Sudan, whilst that has much more attention and the international community has more of a kind of standing interest in South Sudan, there's much more UN and development workers already in there before this particular crisis started. Even that's still underfunded. So we've got a general problem, and then the CAR is the worst end of that general problem.
Right, well, we'll come back to this discussion. But now the situation in the Central African Republic has forced thousands of Muslims to escape the capital of Bangui, fleeing to neighbouring cities and countries such as Chad and Cameroon under the protection of Seleka forces. Bambari is one city starting to act as a model of peace.
It's a model of peace in an otherwise troubled country. Bambari, the Central African Republic's second largest town, is now under the protection of Muslim Seleka forces. Seleka General Ali Darasa says that he's going to protect the city from any attacks by Christian anti-Balaka militia, as well as any threats from neighbouring Nigeria, stating that the Boko Haram have no space to settle in their camps. Muslim Seleka rebels were forced to step aside in January. Anti-Balaka militia, members of the Christian population, have since driven Muslims from their homes and burned mosques in the capital Bangui. Almost all Muslims have fled the city, and the United Nations reported a cleansing of Muslims from the country's west. Violence has gripped the country since late 2012, when a battle for power degenerated into violence between Muslims and Christians. Around 1 million people have been forced from their homes, and almost 200,000 have fled the country since December, with a further 160,000 expected to leave this year. This has raised the question of a petition dividing the country into a Christian south and a Muslim north. General Ali says that this will not solve the problems the country is facing, and that it is the anti-Balaka who are the real problem.
Anti-Balaka ko fuɗɗi sawara mum ma kan no fuɗɗiri population fuɗɗiri kan hana no contre armée no contre population ɓe barata fa ko ɓe naati Bangui fa ko ɗo Seleka kantonomi fa ko misil ɗuma démissioni fo kamɓe population ɓe barata fa hande bo ɓe ɗon tokki bara population kamɓe kolli masal ɓe giɗi sendugo leydi amma enen en ngala ɗo man bo en jaɓata.
But many Muslims in this dusty town at the heart of the Central African Republic are tentatively embracing the radical solution to the threat of religious violence from Christian militia. Young people in Bambari are circulating a design for a new flag from cell phone to cell phone for what they say will be called the Republic of Northern Central Africa.
Maintenant, on vous parle, c'est depuis la République de la Centrafrique du Nord. La répartition même a été déjà faite. Maintenant, il reste seulement la déclaration de son indépendance. Tout à l'heure, vous êtes venu même voir la couleur de ce nouveau drapeau. Et ce nouveau drapeau va être l'unique drapeau de cette république laïque.
Mais quant à eux, comme ils ne veulent pas la présence des musulmans, donc ils peuvent dénommer leur pays, au lieu de République centrafricaine, la République catholique centrafricaine. Mais quant à nous, ça restera toujours la République du Nord centrafrique, laïque toujours.
In the latest evidence of the danger to Muslims, a heavily armed convoy of French peacekeepers escorted around 100 Muslims earlier this week away from the threat of violence in Bangui. In stark contrast to the capital Bangui, residents say Seleka-controlled Bambari is a place where Christians and Muslims live in harmony.
Je demande à la population de Bangui, cela veut dire qu'ils sont prendre l'exemple de Bambari parce que les chrétiens avec les musulmans sont ensemble. Est-ce que ça se passe là-bas à Bangui? Je ne sais pas parce que je ne sais pas. Mais ici à Bambari, présentement, nous sommes ensemble, pas de problème.
With the interim government and UN peacekeepers dismissing the idea, the chances of achieving a petition are virtually zero. African governments have historically resisted separatist movements for fear of encouraging anything that could erode territorial integrity on a continent many of whose borders were arbitrarily drawn by colonial powers. But with violence continuing in the region, if the interim government is unable to protect the Muslim populace, a new solution is in need of being sought.
Right, so we saw there some peace in the Central African Republic. Now we know in Bangui there's been a lot of violence. The peacekeepers have been drawn into some of this violence. So are things heading in the right direction, James?
Not really at present. I mean, what we've got, the situation isn't spiralling. I think the kind of worst bits where it looked like it was getting much worse each day, and each day was worse than the day before, that's abated. But the basic situation is very, very, very stark. Something like 90% of the population of the country only have one meal a day. 1 million people are displaced either inside or outside the country. It's meant to be the planting season now, and crops aren't being planted, which means that the hunger is going to continue, and there is still lots of day-to-day violence. So the situation, while it's not getting much worse and there aren't these kind of very high-profile bits of violence that people can latch onto, it's still a terrible situation. It's not improving.
What does that mean for the long-term issues for the country? If we're seeing, crops aren't being planted, these things for next year and the year after, what does that mean for the prosperity of people in the country?
It's terrible. It's really stark. So the majority of the population, most of the economy is agrarian. That's not going to be doing very well. Most of the traders or a large proportion of the traders from Bangui were from the Fulani Muslim community who've been majority chased out. So, I mean, the long-term, or not the long-term, but the kind of 2-year trajectory for the country does not look good at all.
Right, Andrew, we just saw there a Seleka leader saying Boko Haram are as unwelcome in the Central African Republic as the anti-Balaka. Are the Boko Haram isolated where they are, or have they got any space elsewhere?
I think that might be a case of someone trying to make a bit of something that's in the news and make some noise. I think that on the whole, what we've seen in terms of Boko Haram, they are a very secretive and insular group. We can't really penetrate what they're doing or what they're thinking or anything, but it seems to be that they are sort of contained within that region of forest that kind of straddles the border between Cameroon, and they also go up into bits of Niger. But it seems that their focus is on Nigeria, and you've seen that, in other large cities outside of Maiduguri in Nigeria, they haven't been able to catch there either, and it kind of stretches the imagination a bit to say that if they can't get on in Kano, where they speak the language and where they can kind of conceivably blend in a little bit more, it would be very difficult for them to kind of just pop up in a different country altogether and carry out their insurgency.
And further to that, the areas in which they have operated outside of Nigeria, and people are now trying to more talk about in a regional sense, are parts very close to the border that also speak Kanuri. So it's only international in the sense of kind of arbitrarily drawn borders. Otherwise, it is actually quite a tightly condensed area of linguistic and cultural similarity.
Right, well, thank you both so much. We're going to go onto Twitter now. Lots of different things have been trending throughout this week. Let's have a look at some of your tweets.
Trending globally this week on Twitter, the kidnapping of 200 schoolgirls by Nigerian rebel group Boko Haram. Osama Saeed pointed out that Boko Haram must be enjoying this increased international publicity. The topic of halal has captivated the Twitter sphere, with some tweeters expressing their dismay at Pizza Express's halal chicken pizzas. Simon Gardner commented that this is a deliberate endorsement of religion. The memories of the UK riots have also grabbed attention after Tariq Jahan expressed anger at police failings in the wake of his son's death. Halika Siyash tweeted that the media, MPs, councillors and the police all used him. With South Africa elections ended, tweeters expressed their joy in the voting process. Mandy Singleton tweeted that South Africans were all in it together. With Mark Pilgrim ZA looking towards a brighter South African future.
Right, so lots of different topics trending on Twitter. Very, very briefly, I know we saw lots of different tweets, but one of the main things I just want to ask you is, would you eat halal? Pizza Express and halal trending on Twitter this week. James?
Yeah, my local supermarket, Syrian, I eat halal all the time.
I think after years of travelling in the Muslim world, I don't think I possibly object. But I think if people are going to have a distinction, then people who don't want to eat it should also be having a say.
Right, thank you very much, gentlemen. Unfortunately, that is all we've got time for this evening. But, of course, we'll be following your stories all throughout next week. So before we leave you, I want to thank both of my guests, Andrew Walker and James Schneider, for joining us, and, of course, you at home for watching. Remember to keep up with the Twitter conversation using #TheReport. You can also email us your thoughts on the report at islamchannel.tv. We'll leave you with some scenes from space this week, where NASA has been testing out its new high-definition Earth viewing cameras from the International Space Station. The 4 cameras were placed on the exterior of the station with the purpose of streaming live video of Earth. NASA said on its website that high school students in the US helped design some of those camera components. So until next week, from all of us here, Assalamu alaikum.